Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again moving along our Expression Tool Expedition. We are still in the Expression Designer looking at playback. This is the second part of that. Specifically, we're going to look at some of the playback parameters that have to do with MIDI and or controller data from this list of types of playback functionality. And actually, let's start with the one called controller. And when you select that one on the right-hand side here, you'll notice another pull-down menu will show up, and there's another long list of other controller points or controller data that you can use for your playback of your expression. Now, a lot of these won't be usable by many of the sounds in Finale. The Garriton sounds that are built in will use some of these parameters, but others they won't have any effect on the sound at all. Other third-party VSTs may use more or less of these. It just depends on what the sound font is and what you need to do. But they're all here and available to you if you need them. And you'll notice in this list there are some numbers missing, so it'll go from 18, 19 to 32, and then 32 to 64. You can access the numbers in between. They just don't list them all. It's just a matter of typing that number in here to choose the appropriate controller number. And then once you do that, of course, you can use the set to value or the execute shape as needed. What you should know is that for some of these controller data, like volume and pan specifically, which maybe you might want to use at some point, the source for those is actually found in the score manager in the volume and pan section right here. These are sort of the base values that these instruments are set to. And from these base values, you can use that expression playback functionality to modify it or override that value in the score manager. So for example, if I were to choose controller volume and set this value to 125, I've now overridden that 101 volume in this expression and made it 125. And in fact, I've done that here with the bassoon part. You can see I've set two expressions here with the volume set to 127 and then 65. And you can see what that does. Loud and not so loud. All right. There's other things you can do like pedal on and pedal off. Again, with human playback, a lot of these things will be sort of built into the music character. So if you had put a pedal marking with a release marking here, you would get this pedal on and pedal off anyway. But this is sort of the manual way to do it. Now with on and off type of parameters, like the sustain pedal, for example, what you need to know is that in the set to value number, basically any number between 64 to 127 will be on. Any number between 0 and 63 will be off. So here it doesn't matter, I've got 127 set. That means that the sustain pedal is set to on. For the pedal off, I've got sustain pedal set to 0. So again, it's just how that works. Just choose any number between 64 to 127 to turn it on. Now, I mentioned that some of the controller numbers are missing, and in this case, I have some contact sounds in my computer that I use as a Session Strings Pro 2, and I've got it set up so that controllers 50 and 52 will tell the sound to switch from arco to pits. Now you can use the arco and pits technique texts and reset these, but Finale won't recognize them all the time if you're using third-party VSTs. So sometimes you do have to create these or modify the arco and pits that exist in the file already. So in this case, I just created some new ones here, and you'll see the result. Actually, let me see if I can just show you in the contact player. Oops, just so you can see this. You see it's down in this section here where I've got the controller numbers set for these different techniques. So that's what's going on. It's setting controller 50 on and controller 52 on. So you would get that from your contact sound. There we go. And I forgot that if you zoom in too far, you don't see the music though. All right, so that's what the controller data would do. All right, so the next one I want to talk about is key velocity. And key velocity is going to be relevant with dynamics primarily. And all of the dynamics that are built into the default file will have playback key velocities of a certain amount. In fact, the forte is set to 88, and actually you can see it down in the bottom left. Finale does this handily for you. It tells you what they are. So 88 for forte, 101 for fortissimo, mezzo forte 75, etc. You can sort of see what the playback effect is set to. Now, here's the thing about key velocity in Finale. It's very confusing. It doesn't behave exactly as you think it should. When you use the dynamics with the key velocity playback, it will only really work if human playback is on. So I've got human playback on, and as you probably are aware, if you play back this passage right here, you'll hear different volumes. All right, so you can sort of see the volumes getting... There we go, stop. You can sort of see the volumes getting a little bit louder and softer as the dynamics progress. If you turn human playback off, you will not hear these differences. All right. If you're using, now this is with audio units, right? If you're using Play Finale through MIDI, I'm not going to switch this right now, but I'll tell you straight out. If you use it with through MIDI, then it doesn't matter if you have human playback on or off. You will hear the differences in dynamics. It's just how that works. Now, here's another problem with key velocities in Finale, and in regards to that, it doesn't exactly work the way you think. Key velocities playback technically calculates a difference between the base key velocity set in human playback. So if we go to the playback controller, there's a base key velocity here for 64, and that will apply when there's no human playback. But if you go to the human playback preferences, where it says dynamics and volume, there's a base velocity here of 80. All right, so what Finale's doing with these key velocity settings here is it's calculating a difference between the base key velocity set in human playback and the individual notes' velocities. The number 0 is ignored, so effectively you can't actually mute notes using a 0 velocity. The other trick to this is that most instruments in Finale, with the exception of pianos and I'd say harpsichords, percussion instruments and that nature, sustaining instruments, right? The key velocity only affects the attack of the note, which is, if you're used to MIDI, you always think of key velocity as controlling the entire volume of the length of the note, but it doesn't work that way in Finale. For more sustaining instruments, the attack itself is controlled by the key velocity. The volume that occurs after the attack has taken place is either controlled by one of the controller values, the number 1, the number 7, or the number 11 controller values, which is what is that, modulation volume, and what's number 11? The expression controller. So it's weird to think about, but the key velocity only affects the attack. So if you set the key velocity to 0, you won't notice a difference because Finale will play the 0 and then very quickly get to whatever volume it needs to be for the forte marking that it's interpreting internally, I guess. So you wouldn't ever really notice that you've set your key velocity to 0. The thing about that is that the values set for those controller data, number 1, 7, or 11, are relative based on what the key velocity is, if that makes sense. So the fact that the forte marking is 88 versus the piano marking, which is, 49, the difference in that is also making the difference in those controller datas 1, 7, and 11. It's totally confusing, but this is what's going on, and this is why you can never actually create a dynamic with a 0 key velocity and expect that to mute the instrument. If you need to actually mute an instrument for a short period of time, the way to do that is actually to use a new expression that has a volume like the ones that I set up here with volume 127 and 65, but use one that has a volume set to 0. And again, what that would do would override the volume from the score manager and set it to 0 so that it would mute. That's one way to mute it, and then of course you'd have to remember to add another expression to unmute it. The other way to do this is if you have the JW plugin set, and in the JW change plugin, if we go to playback, there's an option here to mute the selected measures. And when you click on this and press close, now those two measures will now be muted, just like that. And then when we get to that fourth measure, it will play. What the JW plugin is actually doing here, if you go into the Speedy entry and hold down Option and click on any measure, we get this super secret Edit Frame dialog box, and you'll see somewhere over here, where is it? Playback, here it is. You'll see it unchecked. Now this Edit Frame, I haven't even touched on this at all in this tutorial, but this Edit Frame is a very technical box that controls every single aspect of the attributes of the notes within the measure, and playback is one of them. So that JW plugin, what it does is it opens up this frame and goes through every single entry, which is every single note, and unchecks this playback box. Right. So if I were to actually go into the first measure where I didn't mute it, you'd see that the playback is checked for all of these entries. All right. So that's sort of what's going on with that JW plugin. And that is probably a better way to mute a section of music if you need to. Or you can use the volume controller and set it to 0. All right, so that it's really confusing, but that is key velocity. Again, with human playback, there's really not much of a need to mess with the key velocities of your dynamics. But if you feel generally that your forte is a little bit not forte enough, you can actually adjust that key velocity of 88 a little bit higher, and it will it will make the fortes a little bit louder by not only increasing the attack but also increasing the controller's 1, 7, or 11 proportionally. So again, with human playback, it sort of makes the need to go into that key velocity playback aspect sort of irrelevant. So anyway, so moving on, let's look at transposition. Now, transposition is a fairly simple aspect of the playback, and I've got a few here, one up a half step, down a half step. And what you'll see here is the playback. We've got transposition selected here, and this is fairly simple to use. Set the value. Every number is a half step, so 1 is a half step up, 2 is a whole step up, 3 is a minor third up, etc., and then negative numbers as well. 0 would be no transposition, obviously. -1 would be down a half step, -2 down a whole step. And this will literally allow you to just transpose the section of music up. And again, if you set this up a half step, if I didn't have these other ones here, this entire staff would be up a half step for the rest of the score. So you just have to use with caution. And I'm not, I don't know why you'd actually need to use this, but it is there if you need it. And as you can see, I've written the same 4 notes with these transposition expressions here, and you'll hear it play back that way. Up a half step, down a half step from original, and then just remember to reset it. All right, so that's transposition. It's fairly simple. Plus and minus whole numbers will give you plus and minus half steps. So let's talk about the pitch wheel real quick. Let's go in here and check this out. We've got pitch wheel selected. Now with the pitch wheel, we can use either set to value number or an execute shape. And both of these have their own uses on occasions. If you want something like a fall or something, you would need to use an execute shape. And let me I think I have one set up here, don't I? Let's see. Oh, I put it in the miscellaneous. There we go. I have this character here, or the shape rather, that has a playback, pitch wheel, execute shape, and it looks like this. And again, I'm not going to get into the shape design or the executable shape designer too much here, although I am in a second. So for one of the other aspects, but anyway, I've got this set to do a fall here, and you'll see the result. You can hear it kind of fall. Again, this just with the same with the transposition with the pitch wheel, you do have to make sure that you reset the pitch wheel. So I do have this particular expression that's called pitch wheel here. I do have it set back to pitch wheel 0 so that it sets it back to 0. Otherwise, what will happen is that the pitch wheel will bend down in that case, and then it won't reset unless you set it back to 0. So if I were to continue playing without resetting it, you'd get some pitches that are well underneath what the pitches actually should be. There's a really neat thing that you can do with the pitch wheel expression here, playback expression, in using them for quarter sharps and quarter flats and whatnot, and microtones. And you'll see that I have these sort of quarter sharp, 3/4 sharp, I guess these are expressions here on the pitches, and the playback has this set to value. Now, the values available for the pitch wheel, so get ready for this. The pitch wheel range of values will go from between negative 8,192 to positive 8,191, where 0 is the center. Now, those extreme numbers, negative 8,192, will give you a pitch of 1 octave lower. Positive 8,191 will give you 1 octave higher. So I've done some math for you, and the number 682, either negative or positive, will give you a half step. So positive 682 will give you a half step up. So in order to get a quarter sharp, you would use a set to value of 341, which would be half of a half step, right? So you get a quarter sharp with a value of 341. Now you do sort of have to do some internal math about this, because if you think about this measure without the accidentals, this is a D natural. This is also a D natural, as Finale considers it. It's just that this expression now makes it a D quarter sharp, right? The following is a D sharp. Now I have these invisible expressions here, which have playback of the pitch wheel that resets it to 0. And the reason for that is that if I didn't do that, I would be adding 341 pitch wheel to the D sharp. So I'd be going from D quarter sharp to D 3/4 sharp, unless I reset to a normal pitch, which would give me the D sharp, if that makes sense. And then I'm adding another quarter sharp to this, so this playback has a pitch wheel of 341 as well, because now I'm adding a quarter sharp to the sharp. Because remember, in the way the Finale is thinking about this is a D sharp, but this is also a D sharp, it just doesn't have an accidental. I'm adding the accidental as an expression. And then when I get to this measure, again, I'm resetting the pitch wheel to 0 so that we can get a true E, if that makes sense. So again, pitch wheel 0, pitch wheel 341, pitch wheel 0, pitch wheel 341, and 0 to get this quarter tone effect. And when we play it back, we get a nice little quarter sharp, we get a nice little quarter tone scale right there. All right, so that's how you do that. So let's look at channel pressure now. Now, channel pressure is basically what you'd call aftertouch. And a lot of the sounds in Finale are not going to have any effect on the aftertouch. In fact, I have this set here. Let me just show you the playback of the channel pressure here. Channel pressure is set to 0, and the other one is set to 127. And this could be any number between 0 and 127. You can also use an executable shape for this if you really want to get fancy. And as you'll notice with the bassoon, doing an aftertouch with the bassoon doesn't really have any effect, right? So you do sort of have to use a sound that has that effect. And in fact, I'm just going to copy this into the horn part, because I have set the horn parts up to have one of my contact sounds that would actually take advantage. It's actually an analog pad sound. It's not a horn at all. That would actually take advantage of the channel pressure or the aftertouch here, and you can hear the result here. All right, so that's how that works. It's kind of neat. You can get that aftertouch effect on that second measure using channel pressure. All right. And finally, let's look at restrike keys. And now let me just show you where this is in the playback type. It's right here, just about in the middle, restrike keys. Now with restrike keys, you do have to use executable shape here, or execute shape, rather than set to value. Set to value will have no effect on the restrike keys. And literally what the restrike keys does, it's sort of a tremolo effect of sorts, and you sort of have to pick one of these executable shapes and figure out how to use the executable shape designer in order to make this work. Now, I'm going to just give you a very, very quick little lesson in case you ever want to use this. the Executable Shape Designer and how it relates to the Restrike keys. So with the time scale, I don't know why this is. Finale just sort of picked this, but the ratio of 1:1 will give you 8 eighth notes. It's just set that way. As far as Restrike keys go, the level scale will have no effect. This is more for about like if you're using this for tempos, it'll show you the ratio of how much larger or smaller you want the value of the tempo, but that has no bearing on the Restrike keys. The sample rate will tell you to restrike the key every 1 sample in the time scale, so 8 times. If you put 2 here, it'll restrike the key every other time, so it'll restrike it on the quarter note essentially. This use list will even further complicate that matter. I'm not going to get too far into that. And then the repeat count will tell you how many times to repeat this, these 8 restrikes, as it were. So if you put 1 here, you'd get 16 restrikes of eighth notes. And then with the time scale, 1:1 would give you 8 eighth notes. 2:1 would give you 8 quarter notes. 1:2 would give you 8 16th notes. And actually, if you put in a ratio of 2:3 here, you can get eighth note triplets, but it's weird because you'd get 8 eighth note triplets. So let's just set this to 1:1. So I'm going to get a key restrike of eighth notes, of 8 eighth notes, and I'm going to do a repeat count of 1, which means I'll get 2 of them, right? Because you have the original one and then the repeat. There's some other options here that I'm going to sort of gloss over right now. And we have that selected, and yes, we're good to go. And you'll hear this whole note will now sound as a set of 2 bars of eighth notes. All right, again, don't zoom in that far. So that's how it works. The Restrike's keys playback functionality is sort of completely unnecessary because Finale will interpret tremolos. So there's actually no real reason for it. In fact, I have this tremolo set up here. If I just play from this measure, it's the whole note. And you've got a tremolo. And you do have control over the speed of the tremolo from the HP preferences, ornaments and tremolos. You can sort of set the rate at which the tremolo happens. So again, it's it's a very manual way of restriking the key for a tremolo, but it's there if you want it. If you have a really old file that predates human playback, that you probably have some things that are set to that Restrike keys playback function there. So it's there. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's probably something that maybe none of you will ever use. All right, so that is sort of the MIDI and controller type data that's available in the playback portion of the expressions in the Expression Designer. Some of them are more useful than others. I think the Pitchwheel using the Pitchwheel for quarter sharps is an interesting use case for that. Other ones, the channel pressure, sometimes you can use it depending on the sounds, depending on how fancy you want to get with that. So that's what it is. So hopefully this has helped. You've learned something out of all of this, and thanks for watching. And I'll do one more video on the remaining playback functions in the Expression Designer coming up. All right. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.